The sky over Bavaria was a frozen graveyard of shattered metal and trailing smoke. At 20,000 feet, the whine of a dying Junkers turbojet is a sound that burrows into a pilot's bones. 3 American P-51 Mustangs, their silver wings gleaming like executioner's blades, had the crippled Messerschmitt Me 262 boxed in. They had him dead to rights, a coordinated textbook bracket. The German jet's left engine was coughing black soot, airspeed bleeding out by the second. For the American hunters, it was the final, triumphant kill of the war. But what happened in the next 14 seconds would defy every law of aerodynamics, rewrite the rules of aerial combat, and leave 3 veteran aces staring at empty air. Spring, 1945. The Third Reich was in its death throes, burning from the edges inward. Yet, amidst the collapsing infrastructure and cratered runways of Munich-Riem airfield, a technological miracle sat idling, smelling of kerosene and scorched steel. Lieutenant Klaus Werner adjusted the strap of his leather oxygen mask, his gloved hands feeling the unnatural vibration of the twin Jumo 4B turbojets. Klaus was 23 years old, but his eyes, framed by dark circles and the deep lines of combat fatigue, belonged to an old man. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, having survived the grueling meat grinder of Kursk in a Focke-Wulf 190, but nothing had prepared him for the aircraft he was currently strapped into. The Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe the Swallow. It was an aircraft that belonged to the next decade, thrust violently into the present. It had no propellers. It possessed a shark-like, swept-wing profile that made the venerable Spitfires and Mustangs look like relics of a bygone era. In a straight line, it could break 500 miles per hour, making it nearly untouchable. But it was also a notoriously temperamental beast. Standing on the tarmac a few yards away, chomping on his trademark cigar, despite the ever-present smell of highly flammable aviation fuel, was General Lieutenant Adolf Galland. Galland had formed Jagdverband 4JV-44, a special fighter unit comprised almost entirely of highly decorated aces. It was a squadron of experts, a desperate, last-ditch assembly of the Luftwaffe's surviving elite. Klaus had been handpicked by Galland himself, not just for his marksmanship, but for his smooth touch on the throttle. Treat the throttles like they are made of glass. Klaus Galland had warned him during his transition training. If you push them too fast, the engines will flood and flame out. If you pull them back too quickly, they will flame out. And if you lose an engine at low speed, you will fall out of the sky like a grand piano. Klaus remembered those words vividly as he awaited the signal for takeoff. The greatest danger to a 262 pilot wasn't at 30,000 feet, it was at 0. The Allied fighter sweeps the relentless Indianer, as the German pilots called them, knew the jets were vulnerable during their long, sluggish takeoff rolls. The Americans had developed a tactic called rat-catching, loitering above the German airfields and pouncing on the jets before they could build up their tremendous speed. The flare shot up from the control tower. Green. Klaus released the brakes. He didn't slam the dual throttles forward. Instead, he meticulously, agonizingly nudged them up, millimeter by millimeter. The dull whine of the turbines escalated into an ear-splitting, high-pitched shriek. The heavy jet lumbered forward, eating up the runway. 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet. The heavy armor plating and the 4 Mk 108 30mm cannons in the nose made the aircraft front heavy. Finally, at over 120 miles per hour, the nose wheel lifted. A second later, the main gear separated from the concrete. Klaus immediately retracted the gear and kept the nose low, staying close to the deck to build up speed. 200, 250, 300. The vibration smoothed out. The heavy, sluggish controls suddenly became crisp and responsive. Klaus pulled back on the stick, and the Swallow rocketed toward the stratosphere at a climb rate that would have stalled a conventional piston-engine fighter. He pierced the cloud layer at 10,000 feet, entering the brilliant, blinding blue of the high-altitude arena. He was not alone. His wingman, Feldwebel Hans Richter, emerged from the vapor a few hundred yards to his right. Together, they continued their ascent to 25,000 feet. Their mission was simple: intercept the massive formation of United States Army Air Force's B-17 flying fortresses, currently reported over the Danube, heading for the rail yards at Regensburg. As Klaus leveled off, the sheer majesty of the machine took over. The silence inside the cockpit was eerie compared to the deafening roar of a piston engine. He felt suspended in the heavens, a god of the sky wielding a weapon of unparalleled destruction. But beneath the futuristic veneer, the reality of their situation was grim. They had barely an hour of fuel. The Jumo engines had a lifespan of perhaps 10 to 25 hours before the cheap, non-strategic metals used in their turbine blades would stretch, warp, and disintegrate under the intense heat. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Hans's voice crackled through the throat microphone. I see the heavies. Klaus squinted against the sun glare. There they were. At first, they looked like a swarm of gnats hovering in the distance. But as the closing speed of nearly 600 miles per hour ate up the airspace, the gnats resolved into hundreds of four-engine bombers. And trailing above them, weaving a protective net of contrails, were the escorts, the Silver Swarm. Captain Samuel Prescott pushed the stick of his P-51D Mustang Prairie Fire into a gentle bank. At 28,000 feet, the air was razor-thin and bitterly cold, freezing the condensation from his breath onto the interior of his canopy. Sam was a flight leader in the 357th Fighter Group, the famed Yoxford Boys. With 6 confirmed kills to his name, he was a seasoned predator in a sky full of targets. Flanking him in tight formation were First Lieutenant David O'Connor, a quiet, analytical pilot from upstate New York, and Second Lieutenant Benjamin Wright, a fresh-faced replacement whose aggressiveness often bordered on reckless. "Keep your eyes peeled, boys," Sam transmitted over the radio, his voice calm, drawling slightly. "Intel says the Krauts are flying the squirt jobs out of Riem today. Don't let them bounce you." Squirt jobs was the American slang for the Me-262S. Sam had only seen one once before, a brief flash of gray-green camouflage tearing through a bomber formation so fast his brain had struggled to register it. He knew the briefing manuals by heart. Do not attempt to catch them in a tail chase. You won't. Maintain altitude. Dive on them to build speed, cut off their angles, and force them to turn. The Mustang was a thoroughbred dogfighter. The 262 was a spear. If you forced the spear to bend, it would snap. Down below, the German bomber intercept was beginning. Klaus Werner identified his target, a straggling B-17 on the right flank of the combat box. He pushed the heavy stick forward, pushing the 262 into a shallow dive. The airspeed indicator spun wildly. 450, 500, 530 miles per hour. The world outside blurred. The closing speed was terrifying, leaving practically zero margin for error. "Hans, cover my 6, Klaus ordered, though at these speeds, wingman tactics often dissolved into chaotic, individual passes. Klaus lined up the massive olive-drab tail of the Flying Fortress in his Revi 16B gun sight. The 4 MK-108 cannons in his nose fired heavy, explosive, 30mm shells. They had a low muzzle velocity, meaning he had to get dangerously close to guarantee a hit, but just 3 or 4 strikes could tear the wing off a heavy bomber. At 600 yards, he squeezed the trigger on the control stick. The nose of the jet shuddered violently. Thump, 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 thump. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of cordite. Brilliant yellow flashes erupted along the bomber's right wing root. A split second later, the B-17's No. 3 engine detonated in a massive fireball, shearing the wing completely off. Klaus yanked the stick back, pulling punishing G-forces to clear the tumbling wreckage of the bomber. He had barely a moment to register the victory before the radio screamed, "Klaus, brake left! Mustangs!" Hans shouted, panic edging his voice. Klaus wrenched his neck around. Diving out of the sun, shedding altitude for pure kinetic energy, were 3 silver P-51s. It was Sam Prescott's element. They had spotted the jets making their run and had anticipated the exit vector. Sam had the throttle wide open, his Packard 5 1650 Merlin engine, screaming as he plummeted through 20,000 feet. The aerodynamic roar in the cockpit was deafening. "Dropping tanks," Sam announced, hitting the release. The 2 external drop tanks tumbled away, stripping the Mustang of drag. "I've got the leader," Sam called out, locking his eyes on Klaus's 262. "Davy, Ben, bracket him. Don't let him run." Klaus leveled out and shoved the throttles forward to accelerate away. It was the standard and usually foolproof defense of the jet pilot. Run. Nothing could catch them in a straight line. But Klaus made a fatal error. Adrenaline and the sudden terror of the ambush made his hands heavy. He pushed the left throttle just a fraction of a second too fast. A loud, concussive bang echoed through the airframe, followed immediately by a violent yaw to the left. Klaus was thrown against his shoulder straps. He looked out at his left engine nacelle. A tongue of bright orange flame was licking out of the exhaust, followed by a thick, oily trail of black smoke. Compressor stall. The sudden influx of fuel had choked the delicate airflow through the axial compressor. "Flame out! Left engine, flame out!" Klaus yelled, instinctively pulling the left throttle back to idle to prevent the engine from melting itself into slag. Instantly, his airspeed plummeted. The asymmetric thrust from the remaining right engine fought against him, requiring heavy pressure on the left rudder pedal just to keep the aircraft flying straight. His speed dropped from 500 down to 400, then 350. "He's hit. Or he blew an engine." David O'Connor's voice crackled excitedly in Sam's headset. "I see it," Sam replied, a grim smile pressing against his oxygen mask. The jet was bleeding speed, trailing smoke, and unable to utilize its primary advantage. The predator had just become prey. "Hold your formation. We squeeze him. We take him down together." The altimeter unwound rapidly as Klaus pushed the crippled jet into a steep dive, desperate to use gravity to replace the thrust he had lost. The Bavarian countryside, a patchwork quilt of dark forests and winding rivers, rushed up to meet him. He was plummeting through 15,000 feet, but the heavy vibration in the left wing told him the crippled Jumo engine was experiencing catastrophic internal failure. The turbine blades were likely tearing themselves apart. He glanced at his rearview mirror. The 3 Mustangs were still there. They weren't just following him. They were hunting him with cold, calculated precision. Captain Sam Prescott held the center position, riding the top of Klaus's tail just out of gun range, pacing him. Lieutenant O'Connor had fanned out to the high right, and Lieutenant Wright had taken the low left. They were forming a classic dragnet. If Klaus turned left to compensate for his dead engine, Wright would cut the corner and blast him. If he turned right, fighting the massive aerodynamic drag of the dead left nacelle, O'Connor would drop down and rake his canopy. If he tried to pull up, his airspeed would evaporate, and Prescott would core him from dead astern. It was a brilliant, suffocating, tactical maneuver. The Americans had him perfectly boxed. "He's passing 12,000, O'Connor called out. "He's not pulling out. He's trying to build enough speed to restart the engine or run," Sam analyzed. "Don't let him. Close the distance. Ben, pinch him a little tighter on the left." "Copy that, lead," Wright replied, sliding his Mustang a few dozen yards closer to the smoking jet. Inside the Me-262, the cockpit was turning into a chaotic symphony of warning signs. The heavy smell of burning oil was leaking through the air vents. Klaus's arms ached. Flying a twin-engine aircraft on one engine requires immense physical strength on the rudder to counteract the uneven thrust, and the 262 had no hydraulic assists. It was pure muscle against steel and wind. He checked his airspeed, 320 miles per hour, and dropping, even in the dive. The drag from the dead engine was acting like an anchor. He tried to initiate the restart sequence for the left engine, cutting the fuel, allowing it to windmill, and then introducing the ignition, but the tachometer needle remained stubbornly dead. The engine was seized. Crack, crack, crack. Klaus flinched as something snapped fiercely past his right wingtip. Tracers. Brilliant white and red streaks cutting through the blue. Short burst. Just testing the range, Sam muttered to himself, letting his finger off the trigger. He was at 600 yards. Closing. 550. Klaus slammed the stick right, trying to break the lock, but the heavy jet responded sluggishly. Instantly, O'Connor's Mustang banked sharply to intercept, cutting across the circle to keep the jet squarely in his crosshairs. Klaus abandoned the turn, snapping back to level flight, chest heaving. He was at 8,000 feet, 7,000. He keyed his radio. "Hans, are you there? I am engaged with 3 Mustangs. Left engine out. Over grid square Antondora." Static hissed back. Either Hans was already dead, or he was too far away to help. Klaus was completely alone. 5,000 feet. The details of the ground became terrifyingly clear. He could see the individual pine trees of the Black Forest, the glint of sunlight off a winding tributary of the Danube, 4,000 feet. The Mustangs were at 400 yards. So close, Klaus could see the checkerboard patterns painted on their noses in his mirror. He could almost see the faces of the men trying to kill him. "All right, boys, he's out of airspeed and out of ideas." Sam Prescott's voice was icy calm over the American frequency. "On my mark, we all open up. Let's shred him. 3. Fall." Klaus Werner stared at the altimeter. 3,000 feet. He was flying at 280 miles per hour. A sitting duck. A dead man. His training under Galland, the tactical manuals, the physics of flight, everything dictated that he bail out or die. But bailing out at this speed, with his aircraft trailing fire and 3 angry Americans on his tail, was practically a death sentence. He remembered a drunken conversation in the mess hall at Riem. A wild, theoretical maneuver debated by test pilots, trying to figure out how to force a faster, lighter pursuing aircraft to overshoot without using the elevators to turn. It was a maneuver so fundamentally reckless that it violated the primary rule of flying a heavy swept-wing jet. Never intentionally destroy your airflow. 1. Sam breathed, his thumb resting heavily on the firing button. Klaus Werner closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, took a ragged breath, and wrapped his left hand entirely around the right throttle. He didn't pull it back smoothly. He didn't ease off the power. He chopped it violently to 0, and simultaneously, he reached down and yanked the lever for the massive, Fowler-style combat flaps, deploying them straight into the rushing wind. The physical toll of intentionally destroying the aerodynamic harmony of an aircraft flying at nearly 300 miles per hour is violent and immediate. When Klaus Werner chopped his surviving engine to idle and slammed the heavy combat flaps down into the slipstream, the Messerschmitt Me 262 did not simply slow down. It collided with an invisible wall of air. Inside the cockpit, Klaus was thrown brutally forward against his leather shoulder harness. The straps bit deep into his collarbones, forcing a sharp grunt of pain from his lungs. The nose of the heavy jet pitched down viciously, fighting the pilot's desperate two-handed pull on the control column. The airframe shuddered, groaning under the immense stress. The rivets along the wing roots screamed in protest as the massive, barn door-like flaps fought the rushing wind. His airspeed gauge plummeted as if the glass had shattered and the needle had simply fallen off its axis. 280, 200, 160 miles per hour in a matter of heartbeats. He was hovering just above his stall speed, a 10,000-pound anvil suspended in the sky. Behind him, the trap collapsed in spectacular fashion. Captain Sam Prescott and his 2 wingmen were diving at over 400 miles per hour, perfectly calibrated to intercept a jet that, by all known logic, should have been trying to run. They had planned for an energy-bleeding turn. They had not planned for a mid-air parking brake. The distance between the hunters and their prey vanished in a terrifying blink. 1 second, the German jet was 400 yards away. The next, it was filling Sam's windscreen entirely. A sprawling silhouette of gray and green metal expanding at a lethal rate. Brake, brake, brake. Sam screamed into his radio, his heart slamming against his ribs. He instinctively hauled back on the stick and kicked his right rudder, throwing his Mustang into a spine-compressing high G pull-up. The sheer force drained the blood from his brain, graying out his vision for a terrifying fraction of a second. The silver belly of his P-51 skimmed mere feet over the canopy of the decelerating jet. Lieutenant David O'Connor, positioned high and right, had a split second more to react. He rolled his Mustang onto its side, slicing past the 262's right wingtip, so closely that the turbulent wake of the jet violently rocked his aircraft, slamming his helmet against the side of the canopy. But Lieutenant Benjamin Wright, the aggressive rookie on the low left, panicked, fixated on the target, and unprepared for the sudden closure rate. Wright overcorrected. He yanked the stick back too hard and too fast. His Mustang, traveling at high speed, snapped into a high-speed stall. The left wing dipped violently, and the aircraft rolled inverted directly into the flight path of O'Connor, who was just recovering from his own evasive maneuver. "Watch it, kid," O'Connor yelled, shoving his nose down as Wright's inverted Mustang missed his propeller by less than 10 feet. In the space of 3 seconds, the perfectly executed American dragnet had dissolved into a chaotic, desperate scramble to avoid a mid-air collision. The 3 Mustangs overshot the Me-262 entirely, their kinetic energy carrying them hundreds of yards ahead of the crippled jet. The apex predator was suddenly behind its hunters. Klaus didn't hesitate. He knew he had a window of perhaps 4 seconds before the veteran American flight leader reversed his turn and came back for blood. He retracted the combat flaps, fighting the heavy buffeting, and carefully, agonizingly, pushed the right throttle forward. "Please," he prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to since the Eastern Front. "Catch." The Jumo 4B turbine, fed a sudden mixture of air and aviation fuel, coughed a plume of white smoke. The tachometer needle trembled, then surged upward. The thrust kicked in, asymmetric and rough, yawing the nose hard to the left, but Klaus stomped on the right rudder pedal to keep it straight. Ahead of him, Wright's Mustang was still struggling to recover from its stall, wallowing sluggishly as the young pilot fought to regain his airspeed. It was a massive, unmissable target. Klaus dropped the nose of the Me-262, lining up the Revi gun sight on the silver fuselage. He didn't want to kill the boy, but survival demanded ruthlessness. He squeezed the trigger for a half-second burst. Thump thump. Only 2 of the 430mm cannons fired. The others jammed under the heavy G-load of the deceleration maneuver. But 2 explosive shells were enough. They struck the right wing root of Wright's Mustang. A flash of blinding light erupted, tearing a gaping hole in the aluminum skin and instantly severing the coolant lines. A thick, blinding trail of white glycol smoke began pouring from the wounded P-51. "I'm hit! Lead, I'm hit!" Wright's voice was high, pitched with raw terror. Oil pressure dropping, coolant is gone. Sam Prescott, who had just wrenched his Mustang through an agonizing Immelman turn to re-engage, saw the white smoke trailing from his wingman. The tactical reality shifted instantly. "Ben, bail out. Get out of that crate," O'Connor yelled over the channel. "No, I still have control. I can make it to the Allied lines." Wright shot back, though his aircraft was visibly struggling to maintain altitude. Sam made a split-second command decision. The young pilot wouldn't survive a solo flight back to base with a crippled engine and German flak below. "Davy, escort Ben out of here. Stay on his wing. If he bails, mark his chute." "What about you, Sam?" O'Connor asked. Sam's eyes locked onto the retreating form of the Me-262, which was now in a shallow, desperate dive toward the dark green canopy of the Bavarian forests. "I'm going to finish this," Sam replied, his voice cold and devoid of its usual drawl. "Get him home, Davy." Sam pushed his throttle past the detent, breaking the safety wire on the manifold pressure regulator. He was pushing the Rolls-Royce-designed Merlin engine past its operational limits, demanding every ounce of horsepower it could generate. The roar in his cockpit became a deafening mechanical scream. He pointed the nose of prairie fire at the earth, diving after the lone trailing plume of the German jet. It was no longer a tactical squad hunt. It was a one-on-one duel to the death. The altimeter read barely 200 feet. At this altitude, the ground was no longer a static map. It was a terrifying, high-speed blur of lethal obstacles. Klaus Werner was flying the Me-262 on pure adrenaline and muscle memory. The right Jumo engine was screaming, operating at maximum continuous thrust, but it wasn't enough. Without the left engine, the jet was fundamentally unbalanced, requiring Klaus to hold his right leg completely rigid against the rudder pedal just to prevent the aircraft from cartwheeling into the dirt. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, his calf muscle burning with agonizing cramps. He was navigating the meandering path of the river Isar, using the shallow valley to mask his profile. The emerald waters flashed beneath his wings, reflecting the frantic, low-level flight. To his left and right, the tall Bavarian pines seemed to reach out like grasping fingers, their top branches violently whipping in the wake of his jet exhaust. He chanced a glance in his rear-view mirror. A single silver dot was expanding rapidly against the blue backdrop. It was the American flight leader. The Mustang was a piston-engine fighter, but in a shallow dive at low altitude, it possessed a terrifying acceleration. He is relentless, Klaus thought, a grim respect fighting through the fear. He is flying that machine beautifully. Sam Prescott was a man possessed. His crew chief back at Leiston Airfield in England, a grizzled master sergeant named Max Sullivan, had repeatedly warned him about the consequences of overboosting the Merlin engine. You push that manifold pressure past 67 inches, Captain, and she'll throw a rod straight through the cowling. Right now, Sam's gauge was pegged at 70 inches. The airframe vibrated violently, the immense torque of the four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller, fighting to torque the aircraft sideways. But Sam held it steady, his eyes locked on the German jet. He was utilizing the terrain just as effectively as his prey, skimming over farmhouses, pulling up sharply to clear a stone bridge, and dropping instantly back to the deck. He was closing the gap, 800 yards, 700. Inside the 262, the situation was deteriorating from critical to catastrophic. Klaus's instrument panel was a Christmas tree of warning lights. The temperature gauge for the right engine was creeping dangerously into the red zone. The prolonged stress of asymmetric thrust and maximum power was warping the inferior metals of the turbine blades. Klaus knew the geography of his homeland intimately. Just a few miles ahead, near the town of Moosburg, the river valley narrowed significantly, flanked by steep, heavily forested hills. It was a geographical bottleneck. "Come on, hold together," Klaus muttered, tapping the glass of the temperature gauge as if that could somehow cool the melting engine. He dropped even lower, 50 feet. His landing gear doors skimmed the tops of a field of tall, unharvested wheat, leaving a violent wake that flattened the crops in a long, straight line. He roared past a small farmhouse, the roar of the jet shattering the windows. Sam was at 500 yards. He thumbed the firing switch, arming the 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns. He needed Klaus to make one mistake, to pull up just an inch, presenting a larger target profile. But the German pilot was a master. He was flying the heavy jet like a light aerobatic plane, hugging the contours of the earth with suicidal precision. As they approached the Moosburg bottleneck, Klaus made his move. He didn't pull up. He banked violently to the right, cutting into a narrow ravine that branched off from the main river. It was an impossibly tight turn for the heavy jet. The right wingtip missed the granite wall of the ravine by less than 3 feet. Sam, flying a much more agile aircraft, easily followed the turn, but the sudden change in direction forced him to bleed off some of his speed advantage. Now, Klaus thought. He leveled out in the ravine and prepared to push the nose down to gain whatever microscopic speed he could. But the Jumo engine had finally endured enough. With a sickening, metallic screech that overpowered the sound of the rushing wind, the right engine detonated. It wasn't an explosion of fuel, but a catastrophic mechanical failure. The overheated turbine blades finally stretched too far, striking the engine casing at 10,000 revolutions per minute. The engine tore itself apart from the inside out. Shrapnel ripped through the nacelle, severing the hydraulic lines and electrical cables. A thick, blinding cloud of white smoke and pulverized metal erupted from the rear of the jet. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound Klaus had ever heard. The deafening roar of the jet was replaced by the eerie, rushing sound of the wind over the canopy. The Me-262 was now a 10,000-pound glider, stripped of all thrust, flying at barely 50 feet above a rugged ravine. Klaus instinctively pulled the stick back, trading his last reserves of airspeed for a precious few hundred feet of altitude to clear the end of the ravine. The heavy jet ballooned upward, clearing the tree line, only to reveal a sloping, rocky pasture ahead. It was too uneven for a landing gear, too short for a safe stop. It was a graveyard. He was going to have to belly it in. Behind him, Sam Prescott cleared the ravine and saw the smoking, silent jet pop up in front of him. The German had lost all speed. He was hanging in the air, a massive, helpless target. Sam had the perfect firing solution. He put the pipper of his K-14 gun sight dead center on the 262's canopy. He had his finger on the trigger. He had the kill. He could end the hunt right now, turning the German pilot and his technological marvel into a fireball of shredded aluminum and flesh. Sam held his breath, the vibrations of the overstressed Merlin engine shaking his bones. The German jet was gliding downward, fully committed to a desperate crash landing. Sam tightened his grip on the stick. Captain Sam Prescott's thumb rested with 5 pounds of pressure on a trigger that required only 6 to break. The 50 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings of Prairie Fire were primed, carrying enough armor-piercing incendiary rounds to turn the plummeting Messerschmitt into a funeral pyre. Through the illuminated ring of his K-14 gun sight, the canopy of the German jet was perfectly framed. He could see the pale, desperate face of the pilot inside, a man wrestling a dead, 10,000-pound coffin of steel and aluminum toward the unforgiving earth. All Sam had to do was squeeze. It was his duty. It was what he had been trained to do in the freezing skies over Europe for 2 grueling years. But as the seconds dilated into agonizingly slow fragments of time, something within the veteran American pilot fractured. He looked at the crippled jet, its right nacelle trailing a thick ribbon of black smoke, its left engine completely dead. It was no longer a weapon of war. It was a falling stone. Shooting this man now wouldn't be combat. It would be an execution. Sam's mind flashed back to a letter from his own father, a veteran of the trenches in the First World War, who had written about the rare, fleeting moments of humanity that occasionally pierced the absolute barbarity of the slaughter. "A man in uniform is an enemy, Sammy," his father had written. "But a man with his hands in the air, or falling from the sky without a parachute, is just a boy waiting for God." In the cockpit of the Me-262, Klaus Werner stopped fighting the controls. The ground was rushing up at terrifying speed, a jagged, rocky Bavarian pasture that offered no forgiveness. He let go of the control stick and closed his eyes. The roar of the wind faded, replaced by the vivid, intoxicating memory of Johanna. She was the reason he had climbed into this experimental death trap day after day. In the crumbling ruins of Munich, where the Gestapo's paranoia was far more lethal than Allied bombs, their love had been a dangerous, hidden sanctuary. Johanna's family had quietly opposed the regime, operating a clandestine network smuggling forged transit papers. Klaus, an ace of the Luftwaffe, had used his status and his uniform as a shield to protect her from the secret police. He had promised her, beneath the shattered roof of the Frauenkirche just 3 nights ago, that he would survive, that they would outlive this 1,000-year madness. "I am sorry, my love," Klaus thought, bracing for the inevitable violence of the impact. "I have broken my promise." He waited for the devastating hammer blow of the American bullets to rip through the armor plating behind his seat. He waited for the sudden heat of ignited aviation fuel. It never came. Instead, a shadow eclipsed the sun. Sam Prescott had released the trigger. He shoved his throttle forward, hauling back on the stick and pulling his Mustang out of its firing dive. The silver P-51 roared mere feet over the top of the Me-262's canopy. the deafening thunder of the Packard Merlin engine rattling Klaus's teeth. Sam banked sharply to the left, leveling out alongside the falling jet. For one breathless, surreal moment, the two enemies flew side by side, wingtip to wingtip, barely 50 feet above the ground. Klaus turned his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. Across the narrow gulf of rushing air, he saw the American pilot. Sam pushed his oxygen mask down, revealing a dirt-smudged, exhausted face. Sam didn't smile. He didn't offer a salute. He simply locked eyes with Klaus, gave a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement, and then pushed his stick hard to the right, peeling away into the high blue sanctuary of the sky. He had spared him. A split second later, the belly of the Messerschmitt slammed into the earth. The impact was cataclysmic. The heavy metal fuselage gouged a deep, violent trench into the soil, throwing a tidal wave of dirt, rocks, and pulverized grass into the air. The jet bounced, twisting violently to the right as the dead left engine dug into the ground. The immense kinetic energy tore the left wing completely off the fuselage, sending it cartwheeling into the tree line. The shattered remnants of the aircraft spun like a top, metal, screaming against rock, before finally slamming nose first into an earthen embankment. Silence, thick and absolute, rushed back into the valley, broken only by the hiss of leaking coolant and the ticking of cooling metal. Lucas tasted copper. The world was spinning, a violently hazy blur of crushed, sparking instrumentation, shattered plexiglass, and torn aluminum. For a long, indistinguishable stretch of time, there was only a profound, ringing silence in his ears, completely isolating him from the reality of the crash. He was hanging sideways in his heavily enforced leather flight harness, the straps cutting agonizingly into his collarbones. Warm blood dripped steadily from a deep, jagged gash on his forehead, tracking through the thick layer of soot on his face and stinging his eyes. Every intake of breath felt like a serrated knife dragging across his chest-cracked ribs. At the very least, perhaps a punctured lung. But he was breathing. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was alive. Johanna, he choked out, his voice nothing more than a wet, broken rasp in the ruined cockpit. He forced his heavy, trembling hands to move, blindly searching for the heavy steel clasp of the harness buckle. His fingers felt thick and unresponsive, numb from the shock and the cold, high-altitude air he had been breathing just minutes before. With a desperate, agonizing exertion of will, he slammed the heel of his palm against the release mechanism. The buckle snapped open, and gravity instantly claimed him. He fell heavily against the jagged, torn side of the fuselage, a sharp cry of raw agony tearing itself from his throat as his battered shoulder absorbed the impact. As his senses slowly returned, the ringing in his ears began to fade, replaced by the terrifying, immediate symphony of a dead aircraft. He heard the hiss of pressurized hydraulic fluid spraying over hot metal. He heard the metallic groaning of the airframe settling into the dirt. And then, the most terrifying sensory input of all, the distinct, overpowering odor of pooling J2 jet fuel. It filled the small, enclosed space of the shattered canopy, thick and suffocating. One spark, that was all it would take. One stray spark from the scorching hot engine casings of the destroyed Wright Jumo 004 turbine, or a short circuit in the severed electrical bundles, and the wreckage would instantaneously transform into a white-hot crematorium. Summoning the absolute last, hidden reserves of his adrenaline, Lucas kicked upward. His heavy flight boot connected with the shattered remnants of his canopy, forcing the bent framing outward with a harsh screech of metal. He dragged his battered body over the jagged aluminum rim, ignoring the way the sharp edges tore through his heavy flight suit and sliced into his arms. He tumbled out of the aircraft, falling heavily into the damp, dark Bavarian soil. He didn't stop moving. He couldn't. He crawled desperately on his hands and knees, pulling himself through the tall, crushed wheat and the churned-up dirt, driven by pure, animalistic survival instinct. He dragged himself away from the hissing, smoking fuselage, leaving a dark trail of blood on the flattened green stalks behind him. 50 yards away, a thick, ancient oak tree stood like a silent sentinel at the edge of the pasture, He focused entirely on the rough, weathered bark of its trunk. When he finally reached it, he collapsed against the base, turning his body so he could rest his back against the solid wood. He sat there, chest heaving in shallow, rapid gasps, clutching his bleeding side. He looked back at the wreckage of the Messerschmitt Me 262. It was a catastrophic sight. The pride of the Luftwaffe's technological engineering was nothing more than a mangled, smoking corpse of gray and green metal, gouged deep into the earth. The left wing was completely gone, sheared off during the violent ground loop. He tilted his head back, resting it against the tree, and looked up at the vast, uncaring blue of the sky. He searched the scattered clouds, half expecting to see the silver Mustang circling back to finish the job. But the sky was empty. The American pilot had vanished. Lucas closed his eyes, and instantly, the memory of Johanna flooded his exhausted mind, vibrant and anchoring. She was the singular, radiant reason he had forced himself to climb into the experimental, highly volatile jet, day after day. In the crumbling, ash-choked ruins of Munich, where the paranoia of the secret police was far more lethal than the relentless Allied bombing raids, their love had been a dangerous, deeply hidden sanctuary. Johanna's family had quietly, bravely opposed the regime for years, operating a clandestine network that smuggled forged transit papers to those desperate to flee the tightening grip of the SS. Lucas, a highly decorated ace of the Luftwaffe, had used his protected status, the medals on his chest, and the prestige of his uniform as a shield to deflect suspicion away from her. He had promised her, standing beneath the miraculously untouched, shattered arches of the Frauenkirche just 3 nights ago, that he would survive. He had held her face in his hands, tracing the lines of exhaustion and fear around her eyes, and sworn that they would outlive this 1,000-year madness, that they would find a way to rebuild from the ashes. I kept my promise, Lucas thought, a small, bloody smile touching the corners of his mouth. I am alive, but the war, it seemed, was not yet done, extracting its toll. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of tires, rolling over gravel, abruptly shattered the stillness of the pasture. Lucas snapped his eyes open, his heart hammering a new, frantic rhythm against his broken ribs. Approaching rapidly, from a narrow, deeply rutted dirt road adjacent to the field, was a dark gray Volkswagen Kübelwagen. It braked harshly, the tires locking and skidding in the loose dirt, throwing up a cloud of pale dust. 3 men stepped out into the afternoon sun. They were not Wehrmacht medics, rushing to aid a downed pilot. They were not local farmers coming to inspect the ruin in their field. They wore the stark, immaculate, terrifying black uniforms of the Schutzstaffel, the SS. Leading the trio was Sturmbannführer Heinrich, an officer whose brutal reputation for uncompromising cruelty toward defeatists and traitors was infamous throughout the entire Bavarian sector. Heinrich was a fanatic, a man whose absolute devotion to the dying regime blinded him to the reality of the collapsing front lines. Heinrich unfastened the leather holster at his hip and drew his Walther P-38 pistol with a smooth, practiced motion. He marched deliberately through the tall grass toward the tree, his highly polished black boots crunching over the scattered, shining aluminum debris of the jet. The 2 subordinate officers fanned out slightly behind him, their hands resting on the grips of their submachine guns, their eyes scanning the tree line. Heinrich stopped 10 feet away, towering over the bleeding, broken pilot. His face was twisted in a sneer of utter, unadulterated disgust. He looked slowly at the ruined, smoldering wreckage of the Me-262, then turned his cold, dead eyes down to Lucas, the pride of the Luftwaffe. Heinrich spat, the venom in his voice sharp and palpable in the quiet air. Given the absolute greatest, most advanced technological weapon the Reich has ever produced, and you crash it into a cow pasture like a clumsy, frightened cadet, you surrendered our sovereign skies to the enemy. Lucas pressed his hand harder against his side, trying to steady his breathing. My engines, he rasped, coughing weakly, a trickle of blood escaping his lips. A compressor stall on the left, catastrophic mechanical failure on the right. I was engaged by 3 Mustangs at once. I had no power. I was a glider. Excuses are the currency of traitors and cowards, Heinrich interrupted coldly, raising the pistol slightly. He thumbed back the hammer. The sharp, metallic click echoed loudly, slicing through the quiet clearing. The Führer demands absolute victory, not mechanical excuse. He demands sacrifice, not cowardice. You are a stain on the uniform, Lieutenant. And under the emergency decrees of the homeland, dereliction of duty in the face of the enemy is punished by immediate execution. Lucas stared straight down the dark, hollow barrel of the gun. The bitter, agonizing irony of the moment washed over him in a freezing wave. It was a manifestation of the most ruthless, unforgiving hard karma imaginable. He had survived the freezing, blood-soaked horrors of the Eastern Front. He had survived the terrifying, experimental unpredictability of the first jet engines. And just minutes ago, he had been shown unparalleled, unimaginable mercy by an enemy pilot who had him dead to rights in his crosshairs. He had survived the Americans, only to be murdered in the dirt by his own countrymen. The cruel, fanatical snake of the regime was finally eating its own tail, turning its boundless hatred inward. Lucas felt a sudden, strange sense of calm descend upon him. If he was going to die here, against this tree, he would not give this fanatic the satisfaction of his fear. He would not beg. He straightened his back against the bark, wincing as his ribs shifted, and lifted his chin. He locked eyes with Heinrich, his gaze steady and defiant. He pictured Johanna's face one last time, holding her image in his mind as a shield against the darkness. "Do it then," Lucas whispered, his voice remarkably steady. Heinrich's eyes narrowed, infuriated by the lack of begging. He raised the pistol directly to the center of Lucas's forehead. "Heil Hitler," the SS officer sneered softly, his finger tightening on the trigger. High above the scattered clouds, at an altitude of 10,000 feet, Captain Nathan Cole had been flying in a wide, slow orbit. He hadn't turned the nose of his P-51 Mustang Prairie Fire back toward the English Channel. The deep, nagging tug of a flight leader's responsibility, coupled with a profound, unshakable curiosity, had kept him lingering in the hostile airspace. He wanted to ensure the German pilot had actually survived the crash. He needed to know that his decision to show mercy hadn't been in vain, and he needed the visual confirmation for his intelligence debriefing back at Leiston. Looking down through his heavy, magnified field binoculars, while holding the control stick steady with his knees, Nathan had watched the tiny figure of the pilot crawl desperately from the smoking wreckage. He had felt a distinct, powerful surge of relief when the man reached the tree and sat up. But then, Nathan saw the dust trail on the dirt road. He saw the gray car arrive. He lowered the binoculars, his eyes narrowing. Even from 2 miles up, the stark black uniforms were unmistakable against the green and brown of the pasture. He watched, his blood suddenly running cold, as the lead officer drew a weapon, marched over to the tree, and aimed it point blank at the head of the unarmed, critically wounded pilot sitting helplessly on the ground. Nathan didn't hesitate. The exhaustion of the dogfight vanished. The brief, unspoken chivalry that had stayed his hand and forged a momentary bond between enemies just minutes ago evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, righteous, overwhelming fury. He had not spared that man's life just so a squad of fanatical executioners could take it. He shoved the heavy throttle quadrant violently forward, all the way to the firewall, completely ignoring the mechanical screaming of the overstressed Packard Merlin engine. He kicked the right rudder pedal hard and slammed the control stick forward, dropping the heavy silver Mustang into a terrifyingly steep, near-vertical dive. The airspeed indicator spun wildly. 300, 400, 450 miles per hour. The aerodynamic roar inside the cockpit became utterly deafening, a physical force pressing against him. Nathan didn't bother looking through the illuminated ring of his K-14 gun sight. He didn't have the time for a calculated firing solution, and at this angle and speed, it was entirely unnecessary. He was a seasoned predator, and he was dropping straight down on a static target. Down in the pasture, Heinrich's finger was a millimeter away from breaking the sear of the trigger. Suddenly, the quiet Bavarian valley erupted in a deafening, apocalyptic roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air apart. The sound hit the SS officers before the aircraft did. Heinrich flinched, instinctively looking up. The silver Mustang dropped from the sky like a vengeance-fueled thunderbolt, the massive four-bladed propeller a blur of kinetic violence. Nathan squeezed the firing trigger on the control stick and held it down. All 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the Mustang's wings roared to life simultaneously, unleashing a devastating, unbroken torrent of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The stream of heavy lead walked violently up the dirt path, chewing through rocks, soil, and grass in a massive geyser of absolute destruction. The concentrated fire slammed directly into the parked Kubelwagen. The unarmored vehicle was completely and instantaneously obliterated in a spectacular, blinding fireball as the incendiary rounds ignited the fuel tank and the spare jerry cans strapped to the back. The concussive shockwave of the explosion was massive. It violently threw Heinrich and his 2 subordinates off their feet, hurling their broken bodies backward through the air like discarded dolls, directly into the burning, twisted wreckage of their own vehicle. Nathan hauled back on the control stick with all his strength, grunting loudly against the sudden, crushing G-forces. The silver Mustang pulled out of the dive with a shrieking roar, its belly skimming barely 30 feet above the blazing inferno, the intense heat of the explosion visibly blistering the olive-drab paint on the underside of the wings. Nathan banked sharply one final time, performing a low, slow sweeping orbit around the clearing. He looked down through the canopy. Lucas Brandt lowered his trembling arms, which he had instinctively thrown up to shield his face from the blast. He was completely untouched by the hail of American gunfire. He stared in absolute, stunned silence at the burning, crackling ruins of the SS vehicle, the black smoke rising thick into the afternoon sky. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked up at the silver Mustang circling above him. This time, Captain Nathan Cole didn't just nod. He violently wagged his wings side to side, the universal, undeniable aviator's salute of respect and farewell, and then pulled the nose of Prairie Fire up into a steep climb. He banked hard to the west, pointing his compass toward the English Channel, and quickly disappeared into the fading, golden light of the late afternoon, leaving the war behind him. Lucas sat alone in the profound quiet of the forest, the only sound the crackling of the flames consuming the wreckage of both the jet and the executioners. The universe had delivered its final, undeniable verdict. The hard karma of the war had turned the cruelty of the fanatic regime back upon itself in a fiery instant, and in doing so, had paved his impossible road home. He closed his eyes, took a deep, painful breath of the smoke-tinged air, and slowly, agonizingly, pushed himself up from the base of the oak tree. He stood on trembling legs, leaning heavily against the bark for support. He looked toward the south. It would be a long, dangerous, and incredibly painful walk back toward the smoking ruins of Munich. But as he took his first unsteady step forward into the tall grass, a profound sense of peace washed over him. He was alive. The sky was clear, and Johanna was waiting. The encounter between the P-51 Mustang and the Me-262 over the skies of Bavaria remains a profound testament to the unpredictable nature of combat. The Messerschmitt 262 was an aerodynamic marvel that fundamentally changed the trajectory of aviation, proving that the future of aerial warfare belonged to the jet engine. Yet, on that fateful spring afternoon, superior technology was neutralized by fatal mechanical flaws, unyielding human endurance, and a shocking moment of battlefield chivalry. The true victory wasn't claimed through destruction, but through an enemy's choice to prioritize humanity over duty, reminding us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, compassion can outmaneuver cruelty,